right, we're going to go ahead and get started. I'm mindful that people are still joining in this opening time, but we want to be both respectful of participants and make the most out of today's conversation with our panelists. So I'm thrilled to welcome all of you to today's event. My name is JoAnn Kamuf Ward, and I'm the director of the Human Rights in the U.S. project at the Columbia Law School Human Rights Institute. And I think, as most of you know, today's talk is part of a series, COVID-19, Advancing Rights and Justice During a Pandemic, which is convened jointly by the Columbia Law School Human Rights Institute, the Duke Law International Human Rights Clinic, the Columbia Law School Center for Gender and Sexuality Law, as well as Just Security. And the topic for today is Innovating Advocacy, Legal Approaches in a New Pandemic Terrain. And it's really my privilege and pleasure to introduce the speakers that have joined us in the order that they are going to speak today. So first is Dr. Hassan Jabareen, the founder and director of the Adalah Legal Center, focused on Palestinian rights in Israel. Second, today we'll hear from Amna Akbar, professor of law at Ohio State University, Moritz College of Law, and our third presenter and someone who agreed to join us most recently is Pam Spees, senior staff attorney at the Center for Constitutional Rights. And thank you all for joining us today. The format for today's discussion will be that each panelist will speak for about 10 minutes, followed by a moderated Q&A. And I thought I would just highlight the main themes that kind of animate today's conversation. So we're hoping to explore together how movements and organizations are adapting to the rapidly changing environment created by the spread of COVID-19, what tools are proving most effective in protecting rights, and what role in particular can lawyers and courts play in addressing both emerging and long-standing justice challenges. So during the Q&A today, we'll be inviting participants who are watching the program to submit questions via the Zoom chat function, as well as via Twitter using the handle hashtag COVID-19 Justice. So with that background in mind, I will turn it over first to Hassan for about 10 minutes. Thank you so much.
Thank you, and thank you for inviting me for this panel. I am going to speak from our experience in Adalah as a human rights legal center that work and defend the right of the Palestinian citizens of Israel mainly, and also we work on cases, test cases that refer to Gaza, West Bank, and Jerusalem, meaning the area that under Israeli occupation. First, I want to speak what this kind of emergency, Corona emergency, different than other emergencies that we work on. We passed many emergencies, many war against Gaza, West Bank, invasion against West Bank, and other cases in the last 20 years. In those emergencies, we and the other, or we and them, it was more and less clear in that you have two sides and the war started in some time and we know how to expect when the war will be ended. The cases were clearer that not to attack civilians, to allow ambulances to enter, and so on and so on. This kind of emergency is different. The enemy for the sudden became the body of the person itself. The distinction between enemy and the friend is not that much clear. And this makes the state of Israel try to treat all of the citizens equally, in that if person will be attacked from Nazareth and will have the virus, this will affect other citizens. So the body is the most important, and everyone is entitled, not entitled, potentially will be sick. But despite the fact that the state tried to be state for all of its citizens in this emergency, which is different than other emergencies, we face many, many problems. First of all, the historical discrimination. Because of the historical discrimination in all the infrastructure, in health system, in the Arab villages. So today we found that there is a huge gap between dealing with the Arab sector, the Palestinian sector, and the Jewish area. For example, just to give one example, one of the areas that will be, and we are expecting that we are going to face serious problem there, it's the area in the south, Bedouin area, which we call unrecognized villages. Those unrecognized villages, those villages that Bedouin live, Palestinian Bedouin live, they are unrecognized because Israel doesn't want to recognize them, meaning they have no official name, they are not appearing in the map, and they don't belong to any local councils. When you don't belong to any local council, so you don't have services, you don't have education services, you don't have health services, and even you don't have roads access to the villages. Why? Because the state want to take the land of the people, to move them to other areas. Now, when we are dealing with this virus, so we have problem of knowledge, like how this knowledge, public knowledge and information will reach this group, how ambulance will come to this group because they have no roads, how the state can provide testing to this group. Now we filed petition to the Supreme Court about this case, and today the case was dismissed even without hearing the case itself, because the state say, well, those unrecognized villages, they can move and go to other recognized places, but the other recognized places, they are far. And more than that, the state doesn't allow people to move from place to place. Now, at this moment, we are under closure. I am speaking to you from Haifa. I am not allowed to leave Haifa. So those people also, they are not. So this is the serious problem of historical discrimination in all the fields. It's not just about unrecognized villages, other places, even Nazareth, that it's city, old city. Because of this discrimination, we don't have serious and enough access to health rights. Other problem beside the infrastructure, we see that there are places that now it became easy to violate their rights. The political prisoners. Political prisoners, they are in the prison. And you have in the same cell 8 persons sleep and live together in a small cell. That's mean based on all the ruling, all the regulations about social distance, they cannot be and live together at the same place. We asked to find solution for that. Until now, we have no solution. Another thing that became that the state prohibit lawyers and families to visit all the prisoners, criminal prisoners and political prisoners, because they don't want the virus to affect all the groups, and they think that the prison itself as location is dangerous. But what they did with the political prisoners? With the political prisoners, they say that even they are not allowed to speak in the phone with their families and their lawyers. The criminal prisoners, they are allowed to have this contact. Now, what's the problem that we are facing? That we have no information about the political prisoners, because lawyers cannot contact them via phone. Families cannot visit them and they cannot speak to them. So now we are in a situation that we don't know what's going on there. Now we have cases, bad cases, that one old person was released because they found that he has corona, and he was released because he ended his sentence. And the information that we got from them, that it's very, very difficult situation there, that the area is still crowded and no health care for the prisoners. But in any way, the families are very, very worried about that. We submit case before the Supreme Court, challenge this policy. We said that consultation with lawyers is constitutional right, and you cannot suspend it. And therefore, at least we need that to have the contact with prisoners and lawyers via phone. In fact, the court, the panel of the court, see that really here we have a case because this is a constitutional right, and they ask the state to come with a new mechanism to allow those prisoners to contact their families. This case has been pending for 2 weeks until now, still pending, and there is no solution, and we are waiting for the next hearing. So we are going to pass 3 weeks with uncertain situation that the families face. The main issue that we are facing here is the fact that the government start to issue emergency regulations in all the fields. And the government issue regulations without bringing that to the parliament, without relying on without relying on legislation, any law that authorizes it. They use the fact that it's emergency, so they have as executive power to act fast. And we filed petitions to the Supreme Court arguing that there is no authority for the government to issue emergency regulations. The power should be to the parliament. Now, one of those regulations is authorizing the GSS, Israel Shabak, Israel Intelligentsia, all and the police to follow the people. If you are a sick person, they can get about you information, and any person that you came with contact with, they can call this person, warn him or her, and give them direction and ask some time to be in isolation. That's mean thousands of Israeli citizens, thousands, Palestinians and Israeli Jews will be followed. Their rights of privacy will be invaded. This case became a very, one of the hot cases in the country, and the continuation of the case will be on this Thursday. And for the first time, the Israeli Supreme Court decided that even going to broadcast the hearing live. But we are challenging this surveillance to the citizens. We challenge the authority of the government to issue regulations, and also put on other rights like the right of human dignity, and to put every person who sick on corona under a stigma that every person must be away from him or from her. But in the end, if I want to end, yes, it's a new experience also for the court itself, new cases that they are bringing. We didn't have, of course, experience in this kind of virus. It's very, very challenging. We, the Palestinian citizen and the lawyers, they are facing unique cases because, as I mentioned, historical discrimination and the gaps. At the same time, the state expressed its intention that now the war is against the virus. The virus is colorblind. We have to be all of us citizens against the virus. It's nice, it's good, it's give optimistic, but at least you have to give me tools to fight it. This is the problem. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much. And I think you covered a range of issues that we're seeing in Israel, in the United States, and also globally around the way that the pandemic is exacerbating inequalities that have been in place, access to services, access to justice, the possibilities of accessing information and who even has that, as well as thinking about the role of lawyers and courts, which I think we'll return to in the Q&A period, and we'll be watching the cases as well that you mentioned. So thank you. And I'll turn it over now to Professor Amna Akbar.
Thanks, JoAnn, and thanks, Hassan. That was great. It's so great to be here. I'm an academic, and part of what that means is that I like to take time to think about things and develop deep insights about the world. And one of the funny things about doing this webinar now is the way in which we're living in a state of emergency where things are changing every day. And so we have to kind of think through things together quickly and iteratively in a way that, in a sense, we always have to, but the moment kind of underlines. So I'm really grateful to the Human Rights Institute at Columbia and the Duke's Human Rights Clinic to bring us together to do this thinking collaboratively. So I want to talk about a couple of things today. First, I want to situate the moment we are in now by remembering where we were just about 6 weeks ago in terms of the movement kind of landscape in the United States and what was going on in various movement spaces. Second, I want to encourage us as lawyers to rethink everything and to embrace the radicality that the moment kind of presents in thinking about how deep the terrain is for inequality and lack of provision, and the need for really transformative change going forward. And then third, to argue that to kind of embrace that radicality in a deep transformative sense, we should all be participating in social movements and understand the work of social movements as central to the work ahead. And I'm going to talk a little bit about all three of those things, and in the Q&A, hopefully we can start to dig in a little bit more to kind of what is happening now with organizing in response to the virus. So let me share my screen. All right, so we are living in the era of Trump and the wall, the insurgence of white supremacy and right-wing movements. We are also living in the era of a virus that highlights our collective failures to build a society based on care, committed to all forms of life rather than to profit or private contract or property. And it is also clarifying, that virus, the urgency of our struggles, that the lives of people and the condition of our planet is at stake. And while we are seeing a resurgence of social movement activity, protest, and organizing, it's important to remember that we were already living in an age of protest, organizing, and striking from the bottom and the left. Black Lives Matter and the Red Nation, the Sunrise Movement, Gente, Critical Resistance, the nurses and the teachers, the tenants and the Amazon warehouse staff, the drivers at Uber and Lyft, the Standing Rock encampment. The existence of this infrastructure before the virus is part of what is allowing organizing to go online. Then and now, people are speaking back loudly about how our political and economic system is failing to provide meaningful opportunity and provision to the vast majority of people. And for the first time in decades, we also have a visible electoral strategy from the left. We are living in the time as well of the Squad, Bernie and Warren, the Democratic Socialists of America, Working Families Party. Slogans born of protest, like the 99% or Black Lives Matter, Abolish ICE, or Me Too, were remaking our political vocabulary and its grammar and expanding our imaginations even before the virus took hold. And the fact that we had electeds championing some of these causes were giving them a different kind of currency and power. So in the year leading into the lockdown, our movements and in national media and in local law reform campaigns around the country, we were already debating the relationship between open borders, abolition and socialism, capitalism and colonialism, race, gender, and class, not whether, but how to close jails like Rikers, and whether capitalism's crises can be regulated away or whether we need a new system altogether. Leading into now, the left was growing in terms of its ideological purchase and its ability to mobilize people with its messages. Law reform proposals and campaigns had become a central part of our toolkit. The Vision for Black Lives, the Green New Deal, the Red Deal, Chicago's reparations ordinance, Florida's Amendment 4, Ohio's Issue 1, rent control. And all of this is important context for the calls you are seeing now on your Instagram feeds and in Zoom calls and webinars, for the politics and the frames and the organizing architecture backing it all up, whether those are the calls now to cancel rent or to rent strike or for housing for all, or to free them all for public health from our jails and our prisons, for healthcare as a human right, for striking for better wage or personal protective equipment. There's so much more work to do to build our movements to scale, because only mass movements can effectuate the wide scale and deep system transformation we need. So what does that mean for us as lawyers? One of the law's central mythologies is that law comes before politics, that it is neutral and apolitical. Law in itself is a way to neutralize distributional conflict and struggle, and the courts are a central part of it. This is part of what insulates law from challenge. Law becomes status quo with a horizon beyond sight. But it's time for lawyers to rethink everything, to reconsider how we think of rights and their utility, to pause to reflect how our rights work is not a straightforward pathway to more human flourishing, that rights, like any legal tool, are not enough to change a structure rooted in histories of exploitation and expropriation and a current regime of race and gendered capitalism. We have an opportunity now and here to rethink everything, including our role within it, and to commit ourselves to deeper transformation than rights discourse or law on its own can do. So what can we learn from the social movements of our time? The law reform proposals from today's social movements denaturalize law as before politics, and they show law to be a terrain and a tool for political struggle. And the slides I'm going to show in the next few minutes are all focused on social movements kind of predating the virus in itself, but you can see how these messages and these frames kind of animate all of the demands being made now as well. These campaigns point to law as a central site for contesting, polarizing, and reimagining our democratic order in ways that stand in stark contrast to the prevailing liberal legal approach to social change focused on courts, test cases, and individual plaintiffs that certainly have their role but are not enough. So recall the Sunrise Movement's occupation of Pelosi's office, or the videotaped encounter with Dianne Feinstein as part of the push by the Sunrise Movement for the Green New Deal. This protest politics injected with the power of law, and also the power of law injected with protest politics. In this way, radical law reform proposals make clear that law is a realm of politics. It's not fixed or neutral, naturally good, or beyond contestation. It is a terrain and a tool of struggle. One of the other things that the law reform proposals both pre and post the crisis do that's really important is they re-narrate the crisis that we're facing as fundamental, historical, structural, and contingent. So the movement for Black Lives took the question of police violence, the presumed focus of Black Lives Matter, and wrote an expansive visioning document in the Vision for Black Lives, situating a critique in Black history and intellectual traditions and an imagination of alternative futures in Black freedom movements. The vision didn't call for indictments of police or better training or supervision. The vision called for an end to the war on Black people, pointing the finger at a broad range of institutions, together culpable for the state of Black life in the United States, typically narrated in popular and academic discourse as distinct, the state and the market together, for example. It called for divestment from police and prisons, investment in healthcare, housing, jobs, and schools in ways that kind of resonate with the demands that you're seeing today. And so you can see the traces of this now in the calls to decarcerate the jails and prisons, recasting prisons and jails as themselves a form of public health crisis. You can also think about the Green New Deal, which takes the question of looming environmental disaster and connects it to labor and infrastructure and its relationship to the demands today. The Indigenous Red Deal reminds us that the struggle for the environment and the land must be one against capitalism and colonialism. It uses the framework of non-reformist reforms, reforms that don't tweak or ameliorate the current order, those that aim to make it harder for the current political, economic, social order to reproduce itself and gesture towards new possibilities. And again, you can see these non-reformist reforms being echoed in the calls today, for example, to cancel rent. Non-reformist reforms build power, remake our imaginations about what's possible, and shift our discourse to inspire people to fight for meaningful change. Today's left movements are intersectional in their conceptions of the crises that face us. And so even today, you're seeing a number of coalitions come together to jointly make demands to, for example, decarcerate, cancel rent, and have housing for houseless people. In this kind of landscape, there are no discrete issues. Our movements are telling radical stories, denaturalizing the status quo, and reconceiving the crisis of US politics at a grand scale. These interlinked narratives create the grounds for multiracial mass movements. And so leading into this crisis, movements were already identifying and engaged in the struggles of our time: housing, healthcare, decarceration, environment, decolonization, and labor. And all of that brings us to the third kind of thing I wanted to talk about, which is the importance of participating in social movements. Historically, bottom-up social movements are always central to social justice, whether you think about the civil rights and Black power movements, the women's liberation movement, or gay liberation in the United States, or anti-colonial movements around the world. And they're especially important when they come from communities, organizations systematically excluded because of their lack of access to power or formal democratic channels. Movements tend to be focused not on one issue, but broader social transformation. And the tactics include institutional and extra-institutional forms like protest and direct action, all of which are kind of in question in terms of how to adapt to the time of the virus. And they try to focus or bring attention to issues otherwise ignored. So central to today's left insurgency, again, pre and post-crisis, is the underlying goal to build an ever-growing mass movement of ordinary people. And of course, we're nowhere near that. And for that mass movement to transform the society altogether, beyond capitalism and colonialism, toward a different relationship between the state, the land, and our labor, each other, and other living beings. So to effectuate social change, you have to have an analysis of where we are today, a vision of where we want to go tomorrow, and a theory for how we get from here to there. And of course, law school and legal training and legal organizations give us a number of answers to these questions, a number of traditional answers to these questions, and a theory of social change focused on courts and elites. But it's more clear than ever why this is not enough. One of the shifts in my own thinking from working with movements is to move away from a liberal conception of flaws in our system being superficial or not central. Inequality is not a design flaw. It is a predictable product of a capitalist system rooted in colonialism and patriarchy. And if we start to appreciate these problems that we see our clients, our partner organizations facing, our families and communities as structural and historic, and embrace the role of conflict and political struggle, and see ourselves as part of centuries-long struggles for human flourishing, we can start to think of our work in more expansive and imaginative ways, and even start to think of ourselves fairly differently. Movement lawyering gives us an alternative way to think about these questions, rooting us in how we can use our legal skills, training, relationships to build mass movements of ordinary people, organizing to redistribute resources and reconstitute basic social organization. Right now, there are so many opportunities and so much need to join with social movements to be of service to communities hit hardest by this crisis. And lawyers can play an important role if we are willing to show up ready to struggle with other people. It's important that we participate in doing defensive work. So for example, we can anticipate that there will be mass evictions at the end of these various court kind of stoppages and moratoriums. How do we think about showing up with communities to face and confront those mass evictions? We can be supporting offensive visionary work. For example, all of these policy and reform campaigns that I was gesturing at, whether it's to cancel rent or free them all for public health. Throughout, whether we're doing defensive work or offensive work, we need to stay focused on building power and transforming the world rather than being focused simply on wins under law or simply about questions of rights. And finally, I think we need to show up as whole people, not simply as lawyers. The law will not offer prepackaged solutions, and our old kind of skills and tools will not in themselves kind of execute a solution to this. What we need to do is be joining movements, attending meetings, and participating and struggling with other people to kind of try to create the society that we're hoping to live in, and that this crisis underlines how urgent that struggle is. Thanks.
Great. Thank you so much, Amna, for laying out not only some of the ways that lawyers can be kind of reimagining our role, but some of the historical antecedents and thinking about kind of before this pandemic, what was the trajectory of social movements and how do we build on this in kind of this urgent time period. And I hope we can come back to the questions of literally how do we mobilize and how do we connect across moments when one of the things that's been removed is the ability to convene together. So I want to turn it over now to our third speaker, Pam Spees from the Center for Constitutional Rights, to also provide a gloss from some of the amazing work that the center is doing, and Pam herself. Thanks.
Well, thank you, and it's an honor to be able to be part of this discussion. I have been able to tune into a couple of the other webinars, and they've been really useful, and so thank you to everybody who's involved in convening these conversations. And the questions that you've posed for us today are something that many of us have been grappling with over these, well, always, but in an accelerated way over these last few weeks. And I think first let me just say that it's unfortunate that Purvi Shah could not be here today, because she's been one of the people convening us, trying to create spaces for us to have these conversations. And I would encourage folks who are interested in helping out or getting connected to reach out to the Movement Law Lab, and that's just movementlawlab.org. They're doing some really, really great work and connecting a lot of folks across movements with organizers and lawyers, doing some of this thinking that Amna was just describing, which is so necessary. Again, always, and even more so right now. I wanted to speak to the question of, well, I wanted to speak from an experience of some of our movement partners in Louisiana who have been waging a very fierce battle for their lives and their communities in Cancer Alley. This is in Louisiana. I'm from Louisiana originally, and it's a real sort of honor and a privilege to be able to work with folks who are leading this struggle there. And just to give some context, Cancer Alley is basically an industrial corridor, petrochemical facilities between Baton Rouge and New Orleans. And these facilities are predominantly sited in overwhelmingly African-American communities and have been for decades. So it was an early front in the birth of the environmental justice movement in the United States, and it is now sort of one of the ground zeros of climate change and the climate justice fight as well, because Louisiana is losing a football-sized field of land every 45 minutes, and that's accelerating too. So decades, generations of serious health problems as a result of these petrochemical facilities. And so what's been happening though is that the communities who are sort of uniting over time and across space, because these fights have been kind of atomized and atomizing over the years, but what has happened is that they're coming across, there may be a struggle against one facility in one parish right now, but then they are supporting the struggle to keep out what would be the biggest plastics facility in North America from coming into another community. And so people are really uniting, and it's a very fierce struggle, and it has been ongoing. What happened once we sort of entered into this crisis, as we started to see about a week and a half ago, the reports started coming out, the data started coming out about the disproportionate impacts on African-American communities of the virus. And so there's been a lot of discussion just in the last week about the causes of that. Many of those things we've already touched on here. I don't need to go into them, but they were existing before. We had a healthcare system that was actually killing people before. And that is obviously we're seeing that accelerate and expand in this context very clearly. And then the study came out about how pollution is actually a direct and exacerbating factor, risk factor for the virus. And in one of these parishes, it had become known sort of nationwide and reported that it had the highest death rate. And it's again, an overwhelmingly African-American community. And so what has been so amazing in working with the leaders in this community is that they decided to sort of step out and say, you're seeing the data. You know, everyone's discussing this in the media. Here, we're on the front lines and we are the people behind the data. And they decided to go out over the weekend, and they've gotten, they've been using Facebook Live to get their message out. That's become more and more effective. And in fact, it's sort of, when journalists can't get to them, that becomes the press conference. And so I'll paste in here an article about that, just so you have a sense of how they decided to show up in these moments and try to get the word out. And so still build the pressure. This is exactly, what the hope now is, that many more people will be able to see and can't deny what has been true all along, and why their push for a moratorium on all new fossil fuel and petrochemical facilities is important and is a public health matter at this point, in addition to a range of other reasons why we should be doing that. But this was a way in which they chose to step out, and they tried to do it very safely. Obviously, they are one of the hotspots in the country right now, and so are taking a risk in even doing that. But that's one way, and I think that in breaking through that isolation, but also using this as a magnifying glass, right? I mean, and it is a way in which there are more and more people who are going to become directly affected, who might have thought they were immune before now. And so by having folks who have been doing this all along speak out and join with others, it becomes very catalyzing, I guess, for lack of a better word. I wanted to speak to the second question of what role can lawyers and courts play, and I guess I'm basically echoing Amna in this, and Amna, I hope you don't mind, but I'm going to also paste in here the article you did. Oh wait, no, that's the same, sorry. Where is it? Yeah, it's there. Amna did a really beautiful article toward a radical imagination of the law. Is that what it's, I was just looking at it. I don't want to mess up the title, but it is actually a resource that is in a list of resources that we've compiled for folks who want to get involved in this work. And it really helps understand what I think is, it illustrates what I think is the key challenge, especially in this moment, which is that lawyers not become a limiting force on the vision, right? And so the question as posed was, what role can lawyers play and courts play to curb deepened and emerging justice challenges? I would actually say that is part of the work for sure, the damage control, the harm reduction within the system that we're operating. But that we also understand that our role is to help lift up the expanding and emerging justice possibilities, right? And so it becomes there's damage control, and then there's also vision control, right? And we have to really, I think, understand what a just society would feel like in these circumstances. And that becomes very important. And so that's just, the moment is proving everything our movements have been saying, and in ways that really can't be denied. And all of this is not to say that the forces who will be trying to capitalize on this and deepen those injustices aren't they are there. And it is a very opportunistic feeding that they will be engaged in. I think what we have to understand is also just keep our eye on the vision and understand that there's a power in that, and it's a more powerful place to operate from when you understand that we all are movements, we all are agents of that transformation and change, and not that it will not be easy. And all of the injustices that were existing in every place we operate, those are operating between nations, they're operating between states, regions, localities. And so we really are all connected in this. And I think that is part of the strength in it. And yeah, I guess the other point, I think lawyers, where we have a role to play is helping to frame and reframe, so that, you know, for instance, when the community showed up over the weekend in St. John Parish in Louisiana to say, we are the people behind the data and this is what we're demanding. We're demanding a moratorium. We're demanding access to healthcare. They also use the word genocide. And I think that's important. And I think it's important for lawyers, especially those who have been operating within the international human rights framework, to help frame what's happening, not as policy differences, but as, you know, when we're talking about these massive impacts and widespread violations of human rights to healthcare, for instance, that we carry forward that framing in those terms, and these things become criminal acts at a certain point, right? And I do think it helps our communities and our folks to have lawyers who are willing to help bring that framing. That, you know, the U.S. has obviously kept itself roped off from international law for a reason, and as perfect as that whole body of law, as imperfect as it is, the U.S. has still tried to keep itself roped off from it. And so I think it's important to bring some of those concepts in when we're talking about mass violations and what I would say are crimes. I'll leave it there.
Thank you so much for bringing it, kind of the theory into a very concrete example, and also responding to the question of mobilization and what are folks doing. Obviously, we see a huge amount of inequality in our move to this virtual world, but that doesn't mean that there aren't ways to continue to ensure that the voices of individuals who know and have been living what the demands are cannot be part of the advocacy. And in fact, as I think you've all noted, they must be if we want to sustain the momentum. And I think this idea of lawyers and our role is helping to both amplify the advocacy that's already happening, build bridges where we have those connections is really powerful. And we're going to turn it over now to the Q&A portion of the event. And just a reminder to folks who are participating that you can submit your questions via Zoom or on Twitter via hashtag COVID-19 justice. And we have one question for Hassan, but I think I would welcome, I'll ask you first, and then Pam and Amna, if you have thoughts from what you've been seeing as well, that would be great. So the specific question, Hassan, is can you talk about the rules you mentioned, kind of the state of emergency exceptions in Israel, how this compares to past different crises as you discussed, and the law's role in challenging the overreach of power. And I think maybe then we can hear from Pam and Amna on the same question if you have thoughts.
Yeah. In 1948, Israel declared that the state is under state of emergency. And since then, the state legally is considered under emergency. Emergency in the meaning of security. And this is the longest period in the modern history that we know that the state under a state of emergency. Now, the use of emergency regulations since 1948 were against mostly the Palestinians individuals. Until 1966, Palestinian citizens of Israel were under military regime. In 1967, the Palestinians in West Bank, Gaza, and Jerusalem became under occupation, and the emergency regulations became the norm there. So since 1948 until now, we live under emergency regulations. It doesn't mean that daily the state used the emergency regulations against Palestinian individual citizens in Israel. However, this is the situation. Now, what's different this corona emergency than the other type of regulations that the state used against the Palestinians? That type of emergency are targeting the liberty of Palestinian individuals. You can put Palestinian under administrative detention without trial for a long time, and the state can extend the time. They can close associations, centers on the name of emergency. They can declare that association is illegal, to outlaw the association or political movement. Now, this kind of emergency is targeting group rights. It's not about targeting the individual because he is Palestinian or he is black or he is white here. It targets groups that they suffer historical discrimination. So because of that reason, we can speak about different areas of the Palestinians that they are under serious crisis because those areas faced historical discrimination. I mentioned unrecognized villages. 2 days ago, couple of days ago, we submit the petition before Israel Supreme Court on the name of the people of Shafat, the refugee camps of Shafat in the area of Jerusalem. It's under the auspices of Israel Health Ministry, and they don't have any access to health. So now we are taking the different areas, different groups, and we identify the problem that they are facing, and we are demanding rights. Now, other security emergency cases that we face, they have different type in that we defend the Palestinian person, individual. We said, let the Palestinian be free. Don't put him under administrative detention. Don't intervene in the freedom of expression of the Palestinian. Don't outlaw this association or that political party. It's the struggle legally could be considered on defensive rights. Now, more in the proactive rights. We asking measures. We asking the state to intervene. We want the state to come to the areas in order to defend the lives of the people. So here, this kind of emergency, in fact, we are the group that we want the state to be present in social and health rights, because all the time the state was absent in those areas. So now we want the state to be present. In civil and political rights cases, we want the state to be absent from the body of the Palestinian, to leave him alone with his autonomy. So in fact, we can speak about totally two different cases. However, they are both under emergency in that you find the court really to accept the position of the state on the name of priorities, in the name of lack of tools on the hand of the state, and in normal time, those cases should be questioned whether really the state give equal access to all or not. But now the court refused to enter those questions. As for the court, this is like question that speak about how the system will operate. And we don't want to intervene. We don't have the tools. Why they don't have the tools? Because it's emergency and the state must run fast. Let the professionals decide their priorities without intervening the law. Now, in the security emergency cases, the court also behave the same. On the name of security, we are not the professional. We don't know what can create a threat or not. This is why we don't intervene. This is the similarities between all of the cases of emergency.
Great, thank you so much. And I think, this highlights this tension between needing certain services to be accessible by all and also wanting to avoid government overreach and the use of emergency powers in a way that denigrates rights that we hold dear. So I want to see if Pam or Amna want to jump in on the question of kind of efforts that you've seen or are thinking about to maybe more defensively address some of the state of emergency or kind of limits of rights, and maybe just for 1 minute each, and then we'll have time for another question. I'll start with you, Pam, if you want to weigh in. If not, that's fine too.
Yeah, no, I think obviously the effort to get people out of prisons, jails, and detention centers is a key part of that. I think, what's interesting about this moment in terms of the use of emergency powers and sort of the limitations on our daily lives and the way we come together is that it's actually some of the right-wing oppressive sort of forces are decrying that. So it's a strange time in that sense, but obviously I think that we need to be tracking and mapping the rollbacks, the things that are happening now in terms of criminalization of movement and activity, making sure that when we emerge from this crisis, trying to make sure limit the overreach in the moment, but then make sure that there is a reckoning and a reconciling when we come out of this, that we roll those back and get those off the books. I think that's as much as I can speak to at this point.
Great. And Amna, did you have, you want to add to?
Yeah, I guess just briefly, building on what Hassan and Pam were saying, the main thing I was thinking about was just thinking about the creation of the detention site at Guantanamo Bay during a other kind of state of emergency, and the important turn to the law by organizations like the Center for Constitutional Rights to fight that, the existence of that space as a incarceration site, and to fight for the people who are incarcerated there. And I think as much as those legal efforts were amazing and really important, when we reflect back on it now, I think one of the things that is like a real challenge, I'm not saying that it would be easy to do, but to try to figure out how to build public momentum around something like shutting down Guantanamo or any other kind of form of, like intense exercise of state power in the context of a state emergency in a way that kind of doubles down violence on marginalized people of various sorts.
Great, that's super helpful. And I think, just building on this question, we have a more affirmatively framed question, which is, and this is directed towards Pam, but after that we'll turn to Hassan and Amna as well. Can you imagine a way in which a national emergency around public health can be brought productively to mobilization around the crisis that you mentioned in Cancer Alley, and there's similar examples of that in communities in other parts of the US, and kind of how we can leverage or take advantage of the growing awareness that it is communities of color that are almost always the most vulnerable to these health threats as a result of the kind of structural discrimination pieces we've talked about already?
Well, I mean, I think that the answer is in the question. That is the challenge, that we emerge from this crisis. There is a way. It will be difficult, but there is a way in which we can emerge from this crisis better than we all went into it, and that means you know, universal health care. It means, you know, we're asking for. And in the moment, rent freezes, eviction moratoriums, all of that, and you know, there's a growing conversation about UBI, and you know, but I think whatever mechanisms we fight for, push for, try to lift up in all of this in order to come out of this with more equity and in all of our systems. I think the thing that is key here is that we have a better understanding of dignity, right? The right to dignity, and that has to infuse how we think about all of our systems and everything that we are working to put in place. That has to be a presence that is felt, and at some point. So I think the folks in Cancer Alley are actually trying to use this moment, and it's not opportunistic. It's necessary because they're in the deep end of the crisis, which is affecting everybody. That you know, stop the bleeding, put a moratorium on all new fossil fuel infrastructure and petrochemical facilities. We don't need them anymore. That's become clear. It adds to the public health burden. And then at some point, you know, there has to be a discussion about reparation for the harm that's been done all along in the context of a larger conversation about reparations generally. But I guess I'm just speaking to the question and the moment.
Great. And then, I don't know, Amna, if you have a 30-second response you want to add, and then we'll close out with Hassan, and then I'll just give folks information on the next event in this series.
Okay, so I mean, really quickly, just building on what Pam said, I mean, I think the key right now is for lawyers to join in on local fights that have national resonance, whether that's the fight for healthcare, to cancel rent, to decarcerate the jails. I mean, the other thing we haven't talked about, but it's been proliferating here in Ohio and across the country, are mutual aid networks that are developing to respond to the great needs that are being highlighted and magnified now in the way that Pam was suggesting. And so the reason why I want to highlight that in response to this question is because the only way that this emergency can translate into you know, greater possibility, greater strength for our movements and for social change is if we all take, those of us who have time and space to do so, support movements and get involved in movements in different ways. And there's so much you can do affirmatively and defensively around these fights, whether it's things like fighting mass evictions or joining a fight to cancel rent, or joining a local mutual aid network, or getting involved in a local decarceration campaign. But we really need all hands on deck, and that's the only way that kind of we can translate this moment into sustainable change.
Thank you. Hassan, last
Yeah.
formal 30 seconds to you.
This emergency made a switch in the priority. Now, in the past, if we put the freedom of expression, the right of autonomy as first priority, now we are putting the health, the right to live, the right of life, first priority. And this gives us more experience in this field. This experience gives us to see the root of the problems. And now, of course, we don't have to speak on utopia that joining social movement, because there is no any ability to create rallies in this situation. What we can do as cause lawyers, as human rights lawyers, besides submitting cases all the time, to use our profession in order to speak about those problems. Let the community now knows what's the direct problems that they face, and to start to use the website to speak about those problems, Twitter, and all of the social media. I think we can create a new discourse about this. In the past, it was difficult for cause lawyers to convince laborers that you are totally discriminated and go to the street. Now, when the issue, I think, refer to the right of life, and we are going to speak about the real problem that create this and what's the historical discrimination that those disadvantaged communities face, it might give in the future power to the social movements in order to attack.
Great. Thank you all so much again for your time and your insights and for your work. And for all who participated remotely, thank you as well. Just a reminder now that we're over time, just by 1 minute, that the recording and closed caption of the event are available on HRI's website. Past and future events are also listed there. And there will be another talk tomorrow at the same time on hope and rights and responses. So we hope to see many of you there and to support you and your networks and to stay connected as you've all highlighted. Thank you very much and have a good afternoon. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.